WLS
Hosted by IDM.
And yeah, we are live. How are you doing, Nina? How's everybody? Is there anybody there?
Is anyone listening? Hi, Marcelo. I am doing well. Welcome to another fun-filled installment of the Winter Latina Show. And true to form, we will be talking about war and destruction, maybe with a little bit of humor in this episode. Specifically, we wanted to bring back one of our first and favorite guests, whom we've had on a number of times, the Serbian-American journalist, columnist, and historian Nebojša Malić, who is based in Serbia, of which some of us are a little bit envious. And the reason we wanted to bring him on is because obviously he's a wealth of information, but we wanted to do more of a deep dive, sort of a systematic deep dive about a topic that we sort of touched upon here and there. And that is comparing the Balkan wars of the 90s and the early 2000s to the ongoing war in Ukraine. What things are similar, what things are different. This is what we want to talk about today. So Marcelo, let's bring Nebojša on.
Yeah, so how are you doing, Nebojša?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me again.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for coming. Did I mess up anything about your description? I know I've introduced you before. Has anything changed?
No, everything's fine. I am who I am.
You're still the same person.
Yep.
Perfect. So what we want to do today...
Important, one thing that you forgot that changed from the first time that he came here is that he has his YouTube channel. Glazis Americ is the guy from America, right?
It's the voice out of America. It's a sort of an
voice
in-joke.
of America. All right.
I'm sort of like an America explainer for the Serbian audience here because I've lived so long in the States, 28 years, and the name is sort of a joke, sort of a parody of Voice of America, but it's also a parody of this Serbian opposition party that my friend started. So I'm gently ribbing him. It's a nice, clever pun. It's a bit of a Serbian humor right there.
Well, very, very good. I don't have access to this link, so please drop me a line and I'll link it to this YouTube. So is it in two languages?
It is in Serbian only for now.
For now. Okay. So you guys are going to have to turn on the subs, but I know there are lots of people from the Balkans that do listen to us, maybe not necessarily live. So what we want to talk about today is maybe define some very broad categories. So for instance, we want to talk about the relationship between NATO, you can call it the official West, whatever term you prefer to use, and then the sort of the ally country, or at least the country with which the official West cooperated respectively in Ukraine and then in the Balkans, versus the designated enemy country. I'm using big air quotes here, but of course that's essentially what it turned into, and how that relationship developed, whether it was in terms of providing strategy, military analysis, weapons shipping, et cetera, et cetera. We also want to do another category about media coverage. That construction of a narrative, of course, is very important to any war. And we want to see what are some of the similarities and differences between the war in Ukraine and the Balkans in the 90s and beyond. And we also want to talk about more specific issues that I'm sure will come up. But the one I was thinking of specifically is the way that the official West undermined what could have been peace negotiations in both cases. And of course, there are other things that'll pop up too. So why don't we get started, Nebojša, however this works for you, because this is a very broad topic.
Right. Well, there's definitely at least three subjects, but I'm going to try to synthesize them all at once. Haven't been speaking English for months. I guess the way I became the Ukraine expert back in 2014 is because I've had extensive expertise in Balkans issues, having lived through the Bosnian War and the initial conflict in Croatia, and then observed the Kosovo War from the U.S., therefore being aware of the propaganda and how that particular cake was made. And so the biggest red flag for me was how the color revolution in Kiev that started in late 2013 and culminated in the coup of 2014 resembled the original color revolution in Belgrade in 2000, in October 2000. That was one. The other was that the fighting in Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk, started very much like the ethnic Serb communities basically seceding from Croatia in 1991, when the Croatian government came to power that explicitly endorsed the ideology of the World War II Nazi-allied independent state of Croatia that was responsible for a mass genocide of Serbs. That was covered up in the Second Yugoslavia in the name of everybody getting along, and remains largely unknown abroad. It's one of those forgotten chapters of the Holocaust because you're only allowed to talk about certain victims, and the Serbs are not the victims you're allowed to talk to or about. Sorry. Haven't been speaking English for months. Anyway.
You need to come more often to the channel.
For sure. So basically, the Croatian government response was to send militia, National Guard, volunteer Nazi battalions to crack down on this, what they called the logjam revolution, and accuse Serbia, which was a Republic of Yugoslavia at the time, of aggression, and accused the Yugoslav military of aggression because they were ostensibly an independent state. And this was the initial Ukrainian response to the rebellion in Donbass. But the biggest red flag of it all was when, in the spring of 2014, I read an article, I believe in the New Republic, which is one of the house organs of the Democratic Party in the States, written by two ethnic Russians. I want to say their last name were Mironova and Snegovaya, but I'm not 100% sure. I went digging for it and I couldn't find it, which means that it's been pulled. Suggested it's been pulled. And they basically laid out a case, we need to treat Putin like we did Milosevic in the 90s, Milosevic being the long-term president of Serbia. And they explained how, sanctions, war crimes trials and all stuff. I'm like, you guys are literally trying to run the script that didn't work the first time, that you think worked because you've retconned reality in your minds. And you're going to try to run it on Russia, which is, infinitely bigger, more powerful, economically, politically, militarily, diplomatically, and you're infinitely weaker than you were 15 years prior. This is not going to go well. Well, lo and behold, that's precisely what they ended up doing. If you look at the accusations leveled against Russia in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, they are literally carbon copies of what the U.S. and its allies were doing in the 90s regarding Serbia and the Serbs. Putin has been demonized the same way as Milosevic. Russia has been accused of invading, annexing, blah, blah, blah. If it's the Donbass militias, those are really Russian proxy forces. Russia's really behind this. And then when actual Russian troops cross the border, this is an illegal invasion that's not done. Except it's when NATO does it, it's different. And so that's obviously one parallel. The other, as you mentioned, is the propaganda narrative, which, again, these two framed in such terms. But when you take a step back and you notice the tactical propaganda in terms of, again, let's use a blatant example. Last March, so a year and a half ago, the so-called International Criminal Court in The Hague, which was based on the ad hoc tribunal that the U.S. invented to put the Serbs on trial, literally. They charged Putin with unlawful deportations or an unlawful settlement or some such idiocy for evacuating civilians from the war zone, specifically children. They're like, they're stealing the children. I believe the German foreign minister made a complete posterior out of herself at the UN by trying to and mangling that quote. And so this is the same tactic that was used first in Bosnia, against the Bosnian Serb leadership, when the U.S. decided that they don't want to negotiate with Radovan Karadzic and General Ratko Mladic. They just had them charged for war crimes because they controlled that court. They funded it, they staffed it. The court would do whatever they wanted. And then in 1999, 4 years later, the 95 plot against Karadzic and Mladic was to force Milosevic to negotiate on their behalf. So imagine, for instance, if the ICC had charged the leaders of Donetsk and Lugansk and then forced Putin to negotiate on their behalf, so the U.S. could say, well, you see, we told you it was Putin all along. That would have been a ploy, let's say, in 2015, had it not been for Minsk. But what they ended up doing in 99, when they started an absolutely illegal, unprovoked war against then Yugoslavia, which was Serbia and Montenegro, over the ethnic Albanian rebellion in Kosovo, they charged Milosevic with war crimes so that any negotiations with him would be impossible, which is what they did this time, so that Zelensky could say, well, we've enacted a law by which we're not allowed to negotiate with Putin, therefore the only solution that's acceptable to us is Russian surrender, which is ridiculous. So those are obvious parallels right there. Another one is your everyday tactical propaganda that focuses on emotional pain and suffering. So having civilians get killed in Bosnia and later on in Kosovo, it was there was this whole genre of false flags whereby you'd have a military unit either situate next to a civilian building or neighborhood, fire off a couple of shots and then leave. And the return fire, because, let's say they didn't have drones back then, the return fire comes down on that location and, of course, peppers the civilians. And, oh, my God, they're killing us. And, of course, CNN is very conveniently parked there deliberately to record not the outgoing fire, but the incoming fire. That's one. The other tactic is to simply shell your own civilians. And there's tons of examples in UN reports, classified UN reports that were since declassified, of the side in the conflict that basically wanted to provoke international intervention as its main strategy. Shelling its own civilians, plastering it all over the world media, and then having these PR agencies appeal to the Western public going, oh, they're genociding us. Please, you must intervene to stop the butchers. We're victims of aggression. Please help us. And this was all over the airwaves in the early 90s because television was a thing. And this was before the internet and social media. And you had no alternative voices coming in. And the Serbs were obviously banned, sanctioned, if you will, literally, not allowed to present their side of the story. And so obviously, all of these Western reporters, they literally could not stage out of Serbia or Serbian areas because of the sanctions. So they had to stage out of like Croatia or Bosnia, where obviously their local guides would give them their version of the story. And even if you wanted to be impartial, and they didn't, you would have wrong information or biased information from the get-go. What are we seeing today? We're seeing Western reporters staging out of Ukraine, embedded with Ukrainian units, telling the Ukrainian side of the story and uncritically quoting the Ukrainian government statements, defense ministry estimates that are just as fantastical as that famous Steiner attack scene in the bunker. And then wondering, wait, but we thought our Ukraine is supposed to be winning this thing, and all of a sudden the entire front is collapsing. What's going on? Again, but this is because Russia is in Serbia, and these things are qualitatively, quantitatively different, and it's been, 20, 30 years, and you can't run the same script twice. I mean, Hollywood is trying to do that with shows now, and they're failing miserably. Whatever possessed the State Department and the Pentagon to think that the same approach would be a good idea.
Do you think social media is one of the game changers, specifically, for instance, when you talk about human shields or shelling your own civilians? I'm thinking of the example of something like Kramatorsk in Donbass, right? That was, or I guess still is, controlled by Ukraine, although initially was a breakaway city, or using human shields in somewhere like Mariupol. Are you thinking that because there's sort of more information coming from people running around with their cell phones, despite the fact that there are certain sanctions, for better or for worse, about covering the other side. That information is still coming through in the Ukrainian situation.
Absolutely. I mean, going as far back as, let's say, Syria in the early 2011 onwards, there's been, so the amount of time between a narrative being floated in the Western television and it being conclusively debunked, in the case of Bosnia, it was about 10 years. The war in Bosnia ended in late 1995, and it wasn't until 2005 that the final, let's say, authoritative estimate, backed up with some evidence of the actual death toll of the war, came through. I was accidentally involved in pushing for its release as a blogger. It's a long story for another time, but basically for 10 years, all of these Western media outlets were talking about 250, 350,000 dead. And in the end, it ended up, that number ended up being like 99,000 on all sides. So less than 100,000 overall. It was a drastic difference, but and everybody pretended they never exaggerated. It was never different. They just completely retconned the whole thing and played stupid. Now that was 10 years. In case of Syria, that shrank to like a year or maybe 6 months. And in case of Ukraine, we're getting to like days, maybe hours even, because again, drone cameras, social media, you can't silence every cell phone, you can't cut the signal, much as they try. I mean, obviously, people's accounts are getting censored. The State Department is going around censoring all Russian media because they're like, oh, well, they're the reason that nobody supports Ukraine. Sorry, Jimmy Rubin, it's not 1999 anymore. You might be reliving your glorious youth when you were Christiane Amanpour's husband and the entire world was listening to whatever you had to say on a daily basis from the State Department. Because, you had CNN and therefore everybody had to watch it. It's different now. It's been 25 years. The world isn't the same anymore. And it's not RT, it's not Sputnik. It's the fact that everybody has a cell phone. And it's, and they can post on TikTok, they can post on Twitter, they can post on, okay, fine, Facebook is for boomers. But, there are social media where people can post this stuff and it gets around. And so you can either try to play whack-a-mole and try to censor everything, which you're never going to succeed, or you can, have you tried not lying? No, it hasn't occurred to them. But
so what impact do you think the social media disruption has on the actual course of the war? Yes, there are people who are like us who are just interested in politics and are paying attention and are plugged in. But then there's also the general population that is probably not paying attention to every single tweet, posting a video from the front lines that's really fresh. What impact is it having on the war?
Well, in a way, because it has enabled debunking of media narratives. Unfortunately, it has also it's also been weaponized in the opposite direction. You have this entire department in Kiev that does, and of course, several NATO PSYOP centers in Estonia or wherever that are dedicated entirely to just manufacturing, cranking out fake narratives. And, anything from like the Snake Island and the Ghost of Kiev and all this other stuff that just gets incessantly cranked out for public consumption. And of course, the first target is the online audience. They're, little NAFO trolls. And then they go into and make their way to mainstream media outlets for your average American who believes whatever they see on TV because they're not taught. I mean, I always make a distinction. I say Americans are not stupid. They're just tremendously ignorant because they're taught in school not to ask questions, ask wrong questions, and generally no facts whatsoever about the wider world. They're taught the process, which is great, but they're not taught any sort of basis. And you need both, really. So having had an American education, I've seen.
Well, I would say Canada is very similar. I mean, Canada's sort of attached, right, as a NATO ally to the north, as a little NATO ally to the north. But yeah, I would say it's kind of. I've always found it remarkable that you have the superpower. Now, granted, it's a superpower that's declining. That would be so insular and provincial in its education about the outside world. And of course, eventually you start thinking whether that's been deliberately done compared to the level of education that people used to receive, decades ago. So that's definitely a question that has come up.
Yeah, I will never forget, there was a story, 15 years ago, in the early aughts, of this American missionary couple that went to Kosovo to proselytize some kind of Protestant denomination. And they're in Deceni, which was built 100 years before Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean. Like the Serb Orthodox monastery in Deceni is older than the Western concept of the American continent. And they're like, oh yeah, we came here to bring the church. I'm like, guys, look behind you. What is that? Have you no eyes? Have you no situational awareness? Not to mention that the people they came to proselytize are Muslim, and therefore, any apostasy is punishable by death. I mean, these people are just innocents abroad, as Mark Twain famously put it. But this is the kind of well-intentioned ignorance that kills both people engaged in it abroad, as well as, because the U.S. public just doesn't know anything and takes the media at face value about these things, and tends to emotionally react to propaganda techniques designed to provoke an emotional reaction. Do
you think beyond these centers that are, sorry to interrupt, that are pumping out this content for consumption, primarily of the online audience, do you think it's having any kind of greater impact on the course of the war, maybe at a political level?
Well,
or even a geopolitical level internationally?
Well, the fact that you have debunking of these narratives in real time, and that there is a variety of open source intelligence sites out there, and not just the Western agents ones, that there is a robust discussion, that there are alternative viewpoints, there are people who are allowed to question this allowed to question this. That's such an American thing to say. But who do question these narratives, and you've got the Indians, you've got the Chinese, you've got various media in Africa, you've got media in Latin America. Everybody's sort of realized after the 90s that one of the reasons the US and the collective West are ruling the world is not their military might, it's their propaganda domination. It's the ability to shape narratives. So everybody's trying to get in on the narrative battlefield. It's logical. And so you've got this democratization of narratives now, which is what makes it much more difficult for the U.S. government to do what it did in the 1990s. But they're doing it anyway because they know no other way.
So do you think it's kind of an ideological delusion, kind of buying your own VS, that it worked, in their opinion, the first time in the Balkans, therefore it'll work this time around? Or is it more cynical than this? At this point, I think it's pretty clear the way the war in Ukraine is going, but nonetheless, all kinds of effort is being put into extending it by any and every means necessary.
Well, it could be. I mean, I try not to attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence, but you really have to be galactically incompetent to try to run the same script on a completely different situation. And yet that's what they did. That's what they said they would do. And here's the thing, though. You say that it's obvious how the war in Ukraine is going. It might be obvious to you and me and Marcelo because we're looking at these sources. We're actually checking information from the front lines. We see where the front lines have moved. We see the videos of exploding equipment that have been authenticated. We see the lists that have been backed up by evidence. And we're concluding that, Ukraine lost, 3 NATO-equipped armies in the space of 3 years, and they don't have enough for a fourth. And if they do put a fourth together, it will be the shadow of its original self. Sort of like the quality of troops Napoleon had at Waterloo, as opposed to the quality of troops he marched into Russia with. But here's the Pentagon saying, oh, no. This is the same Grand Armée that won the battle at Austerlitz. Everything is the same. Nothing's changed. The numbers say this. These are the same people who can't actually pass an audit, but never mind. And who claim that the Abrams was the best tank in the world. Oops. And so on and so forth. But again, they trying to question these priors is heresy. And they're hobbled by their ideology, their faith, so to speak. They're not allowed to ask these questions, and so they because they're not allowed to ask these questions, they just have to repeat the doctrine. It leads them into what we consider mistakes, but from their perspective, it's not a mistake. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to. because otherwise,
yeah, again, I guess I have
Just
a more
not
cynical
enough.
perspective. Pardon?
Ju-
Not enough.
Just not enough. We are doing exactly
Not
what we have to
enough.
do, just a bit more.
Yeah, I
A
guess
little bit more.
I always have to play the devil's advocate with myself and ask, is this just a cynical testing of Western equipment in an area that happens to be called Ukraine? Do they actually think this particular tank is the best in the world, or are they testing it out? And of course, all this other equipment as well, and they just happen to be using, 500,000 people from that country that is their, little puppet state du jour.
So Reznikov, the former Ukrainian war minister, actually said, the Ukraine is the biggest testing ground for Western tech. But he was basically sucking up to Raytheon, where he's hoping to get a job, I guess. Here's the thing: if these Western arms manufacturers were in it for the money, no, they're in it for the money, obviously. But if they were in it to test the equipment and make adjustments and upgrades and changes, they would have done so by now. The only people that have actually done any sort of R&D over the past 2 years that I'm aware of are the Russians and Ukrainians. Credit where credit is due. The Ukrainians have done some R&D. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. So while they're entirely dependent on the West for logistics, they're Frankensteining all sorts of stuff on the front line and to see if it works. And they're using things in innovative ways because of necessity. Your American soldier, that's all due respect to people who actually do this for the right reasons. But your American soldier has a logistical train, 10, 15 men deep. And, and he doesn't, when the Pentagon sends somebody to a war zone, there's an assumption that this is how many supplies, this is what kind of kit, this is what kind of, airlift, artillery, long-range fires, air support, blah, blah, blah. Like, this is the doctrine. And they, when they went to the Ukrainians and said, well, this is how you're going to launch an assault in Zaporozhye over open ground, but we have no air support. Well, it doesn't matter. You don't need air support. You just need the willpower to win. And they got shot to pieces because they've never actually tried this approach against that Soviet or Russian or modern Russian doctrine. And you'd think that having seen this in action, they would go, well, hold on a second, we may need to rethink our tactical doctrine. No. They literally went through a gallon of coke and said, our doctrine's still fine. The Ukrainians are just too stupid to use it effectively. That's what it is. It's insane. But again,
to what extent are some of these adventures, specifically, something as obvious as Kursk, a matter of PR, where it doesn't actually accomplish anything in the long term, but it gets you the headlines that you need in that particular moment for very, clickbaity type of narrative consumption?
And that's kind of where I wanted to make another comparison with the Balkans. A lot of the Ukrainian war effort is PR. From day one, before day one, it was all in a function of getting as much material, money, weapons, ammunition from the West as possible. They've gotten it up to F-16s. They're pushing for this long-range missile thing. I believe the Russians have drawn a pretty clear red line, but because they didn't bother enforcing their prior ones, thinking it was good, it was good enough to destroy these weapons and offer the world documentary evidence, they're in a position that, the West is like, oh, they'll never enforce them. It'll be fine. At least some of the idiots in European capitals. I think there's still some people in Washington who are taking this seriously. Thank God. But we'll see what happens. But a lot of it has been PR from day one. Now, where this maps onto my Balkans experience is the Bosnian Muslims. Back in 1991-92, they had made a pact with the Croats to break out of Yugoslavia and declare an independence. The problem with Bosnia, which is in the heart of the country, is that it was divided ethnically. There was vast areas of the country with certain ethnic majorities, and then other areas that were very, very much intertwined. And trying to do this, trying to separate these groups would be really, really messy. This is not sort of a dimension that we're dealing with in Ukraine. These people are a lot more alike than they're different, and notwithstanding the Banderite ideology. But in Bosnia specifically, these were the people who spoke the same language. They just had different religions and had sided with different conquerors or opposed the different conquerors at any given time. And so trying to keep them together was possible only in some sort of greater whole. On their own, it wouldn't work at all because nobody had a clear majority. And so the Muslims, their whole idea was, well, we're the largest bloc, so we're just going to pretend we're the majority. We're going to treat these other groups as second-class citizens or minorities, and we're just going to get recognized by the Americans. And if anybody fights us, we're going to invoke the Kuwaiti precedent, because that was the most recent thing, the 1991 Gulf War. We're going to hire the same PR company that hired the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to tell U.S. Congress about incubator babies. That was a complete lie. And we're basically going to claim that we're victims of genocide, have this PR agency go to the American Jewish groups and tell them this is World War II all over again. And one of these PR executives literally gave an interview to a French magazine in 93, 94 and said, the biggest coup in my career was persuading these Jewish groups that the factions that were actual Nazis in World War II were now victims of Nazi Serbs who were actually victims of Nazis in World War II. Like the complete reversal of everything. But he pulled it off because that was the narrative, because the American public didn't know anything about World War II in Yugoslavia. And so it was possible for these things to be done, especially since the other side was completely silenced. And this this kind of, let's get somebody else to fight the war for us was part and parcel of the Bosnian Muslim strategy. It horribly backfired because by the time the Americans actually got involved openly in 1995, they had their own agenda. They had actually torpedoed 3 peace proposals, starting with the one before the war and then 2 during, maybe even 4 if you count this one separately, so they could eventually be the white knight that solves this right in time for the American election to give Bill Clinton the foreign policy victory. It was very, very cynical. And the primary objective of this whole thing wasn't even to help Bosnia as such. Very few people actually gave a damn about Bosnia. The overarching objective was to reestablish control over Europe, Western Europe, sort of reinvent NATO as the dominant alliance, sideline the UN, create the American empire in essence, while at the same time, and Bill Clinton is the one who actually articulated this, tell the Muslim world, oh, no, forget the Gulf War, we're actually on your side and we don't hate you. Look, we're protecting you from genocide. That backfired because the Muslim world only got the first part of the message, because in order to humiliate Europe and position themselves as the white knights, the American media and the politicians basically spent 3 years going, there's a genocide of Muslims by evil Serbs and Europe is not doing anything to prevent it. Somebody must do something. And they then presented themselves as somebody who did that something. The problem with this is that part of propaganda didn't reach. It inspired all these jihadists around the world that were in Afghanistan at the time and later in Chechnya to say, oh, look, there's a genocide in Bosnia and the West isn't doing anything to stop it, therefore 9/11. It's like the biggest blowback in history of blowbacks when you think about it. But obviously nobody's been demoted or punished or lost their job for this, and now they're doing it again.
Probably promoted.
Yeah. A lot of these people in the State Department in the 90s are actually back again because, there's no bench. Recycling, right? There's cases in which recycling is bad, folks, and policy is one of them. But so let's just zoom up to Ukraine. Ukraine isn't quite doing the same thing because they're the ones who are the proxies. So they're not saying, oh, NATO is going to fight the war for us. They're just saying, oh, NATO needs to arm us. Give us all the weapons. We'll do all the fighting. That, actually, is the approach of Croatia from 1995. Because I mentioned earlier the Serb rebellion against the Croatian government, the Croatian separatists in 1991, who basically embraced this World War II ideology that had Serbs massacred wholesale, and they actually started mass extermination before the Nazis started mass extermination of Jews. Long before the first death camp was built, long before the Wannsee Conference. This was almost a year before. Just a point of order. Anyway, so the Serbs rebelled against the Croatian government. They won sort of the first round, and the UN troops were sent in to set up this, armistice zone, much like the Minsk Agreement, let's say, in Donbass. And then what happened was Croatia made a deal with the US where they would hire these American instructors that would train their troops and equip their troops and smuggle in ammunition from places like Iran. Yes, Iran. The US and Iran were working hand in hand to arm Croatia in the 90s. And then in August of 1995, when the timing was judged right, the Croatians unleashed this massive offensive in coordination with Americans, or both air power and intelligence, which again, Ukrainians are using, to essentially destroy this Serbian enclave and enter Bosnia afterwards. And there's an exchange in Richard Holbrooke's memoirs, Richard Holbrooke being the US diplomat who negotiated the Bosnian peace treaty, where he's saying how he and this colleague of his were in Zagreb with President Tudjman discussing this stuff. And Holbrooke was saying, oh, but, the optics look bad, massacring civilians. Can you be nicer about this? And the colleague, Robert Fraser, hands him a note that says, and I'm quoting from memory, Dick, we hired these guys to be our junkyard dogs. Now is not the time to be squeamish. Yeah. This same Fraser takes a spill from this mountain road in Bosnia in his armored car and gets killed. Something Holbrooke completely baselessly blamed on the Serbs. But Holbrooke is arrogant enough to reveal this in his memoirs because he thinks that's fine. And so you fast forward to 2014, and you have Yuri Lutsenko, who is Poroshenko's advisor at the time, and he would later become the prosecutor general to replace the guy that Biden had fired, infamously, and when he talked about it in that Brookings clip. And Lutsenko, meaning that Lutsenko was obviously vetted by the Americans, right? So Lutsenko makes a proposal in this Ukrainian newspaper in 2014 and says, now is not the time to fight. Now is the time to be like Croatia, build up our armed forces, and then when the time is right, sweep the separatists off the map in one fell swoop like Operation Storm. Again, quoting from memory, paraphrasing from, retranslated stuff. But he's literally saying, let's follow the Croatian example. Let's follow the Croatian playbook. And this was almost, 10 years to the day.
So I guess what you're saying, it was much more conscious than sort of using this cookie cutter policy and then having it sort of fit, even though the scenario is a little bit different. That's really fascinating.
Well, I mean, you had the Bosnian Muslims who wanted the world to fight their battles, and you had the Ukrainians who want to be junkyard dogs.
Right.
It's not quite the same, but
definite parallels. It's remarkable in a bad way. I have two questions for you. I might have to ask them sort of back to back. The first question is, you addressed the way that the original peace negotiations in the Balkans were torpedoed, and you explained why that happened. Why were the Ukrainian peace negotiations torpedoed? I mean, we recently had Ms. Nuland come out and also weigh in on that topic very openly. What is your opinion of that? And my second question is sort of just occurred to me because the 90s, of course, is a really pivotal moment. We talked about that before. And you talk about how that foreign policy win was really important to Bill Clinton. But the interesting thing is that when he first came to power, he was really criticized for not focusing on foreign policy in his initial term. This was sort of that Francis Fukuyama moment where, liberalism has triumphed across the world. We're going to focus on making money and making everyone prosperous, right? Everyone being in big air quotes. So how do you think Bill Clinton transformed from this guy who supposedly didn't have much interest in foreign policy to being either directed or sucked in or making his own decision to just jump into the Balkans and use it to his advantage? So 2 different questions. Let me know if I need to remind you.
I'm going to smoosh them together. So Clinton campaigned in '92 against Bush, the elder, on intervening in Bosnia. His foreign policy team, which was the Zbigniew Brzezinski faction of Washington, you basically had either acolytes of Brzezinski or acolytes of Kissinger. Those were the Team A and Team B of the Council of Foreign Relations. And I believe to this day, that's still the bench, except that unfortunately, almost everybody is a disciple of Brzezinski now. But they were essentially saying, oh, Bush is too timid. We need to intervene. We can't just retreat home after the Gulf War. The lesson is not to retrench. The lesson is to be more aggressive. The lesson is to double down. And but because even though they campaigned for being more aggressive, they didn't actually do it because the timing wasn't right and the pieces were not in place yet. It took like 3 years to set everything in place. You had to gradually involve, because the American people didn't want a war. They'd fought a war in the Gulf. They thought they'd beat the Vietnam syndrome. They wanted to enjoy the peace dividend. The Cold War was over. You had an economic crisis at home that needed handling. You had a whole healthcare problem exacerbated by other things. You had, Hillary was going to reinvent healthcare. There were acute political things that had to be taken care of at home. And so they they put things into motion in the world, in foreign policy, that were going to bear fruit down the line. And meanwhile, they wanted to prolong the Bosnian War because that was their perfect setup for what they wanted to do. Somalia, they had an intervention in Somalia that blew up big time in 1993. Black Hawk Down and all this Mogadishu fiasco. They were supposed to replace the UN. That didn't work there at all. So that was a setback. But meanwhile, here they are in Bosnia. First of all, the American ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, visited Bosnia in March of 1992. It was still part of Yugoslavia. It was still part of his purview. And the 3 ethnic parties that had won the election and had sort of formed a government and had reached a tentative deal on how to have an independent Bosnian state, because that was a huge compromise for some. Basically, the Croats and the Muslims wanted an independent state. The Serbs wanted to stay in Yugoslavia. The Serbs accepted an independent state, but it was supposed to be partitioned into ethnic provinces. And these ethnic provinces were supposed to be sort of a jigsaw puzzle. And they were not supposed to be contiguous, and they had limited authority, but it was supposed to be sort of a Swiss solution. They even called them cantons. And this was known as the Cudillero Plan after the Portuguese foreign minister, I believe, or the prime minister who had proposed it. And they actually signed it. They actually signed the damn thing in Lisbon in early March. And then Zimmerman comes to Sarajevo and meets with Izetbegovic, the Bosnian Muslim leader, and literally says, if you don't like it, why sign it? This is the April Glaspie moment with Saddam Hussein before the invasion of Kuwait. We have no interest in your Arab quarrels. And 6 months later, they invade Kuwait. Because
Boris Johnson moment.
Right. So I'm building up to this. So Izetbegovic reneges on the Lisbon Agreement. Bosnia erupts into war. The first peace plan that the UN and the EU proposed, because they had this whole peace conference that they were trying to do, the so-called Vance-Owen plan, also envisions ethnic provinces. This time the map is slightly different. And almost everybody says yes. The Serbs reject it, but by that point, the Muslims have rejected it as well, which is sort of goes unmentioned. Why? Because the Americans told them not to. The Americans were like, yeah, no, if you don't like it, don't sign it. We don't like it, don't do it. So Vance, the former U.S. Secretary of State under Nixon, he's hurt by this betrayal of the Clinton administration, and he resigns. He's replaced by Thorvald Stoltenberg, the father of the current NATO NPC. And I know, small world. And the Owen Stoltenberg plan next year is essentially a variation of this with different maps. That too gets rejected by the Muslims this time because the US tells them to. And, there's this peace conference on this British aircraft carrier back when the British still had aircraft carriers. And everybody's like, yeah, do this, please. People are dying. We need to stop dying. Please just get this done. And Izetbegovic goes and says, nah, I don't like it. And the whole thing fails. And so at this point, the Americans are like, aha, now we've got it. So they completely sidelined the UN, completely sidelined the EU, and proposed something called the Contact Group, which is this ad hoc collection of countries that have self-appointed as the arbiters of the Bosnian conflict. And they come up with this proposal that doesn't work at all. Their plan is rejected, obviously, because it's designed to be rejected, because it was supposed to serve as a pretext for NATO involvement, which it did. And the only thing from that plan that actually survives to the final Dayton Agreement was their key for partition of Bosnia, which was the 51% for the Muslim Croat Federation and 49% for the Bosnian Serbs. Because that's the corporate think of this is, if we have 51%, we have ownership. It tells you exactly which mindset that came from. So, and by that point, by the point the Dayton Peace Accords are proposed, which were very, very, very much improvised, and actually Holbrook's memoirs are a fascinating insight as to how it actually went and who played what kind of role. You read those memoirs and you realize that Milosevic was absolutely unfairly demonized all these years. And it was Holbrook's own pen who hated Milosevic. But it was this point because, again, this is when it suited American interests. And this is when, the Clinton administration says, now we've got you. Now we can do this. Now we can put our plan in motion. Now everything is in place. They didn't really care about the Bosnian Muslims. They used them. The Muslims thought they were using Americans. The Americans knew they were using Muslims. And we have what we end up having, which is a completely dysfunctional Bosnia in which, the Muslims still think that they can, revise the results of the Dayton Peace Agreement almost 30 years after it was signed. But the U.S. has completely forgotten about it. They think it was a great victory. Now, what happened in Kiev in March and April of 2022? You have these talks in Istanbul. You've had Russian envoys speaking up about it. You've had Zelensky's envoy speaking up about it. And they're like, yeah, no, we had pretty much everything sorted out. The Russians were saying, and this, I'm quoting from memory, I believe his name is David Arahamia, is Zelensky's parliamentary, like the head of the majority leader in the Rada, or however they style it. And he's like, yeah, the Russians would have stopped at these three conditions, and it would have been all over. And then he catches himself like, but we didn't trust him really to do that, because he has to say that now. But he confirmed essentially that there was a working peace proposal, and the Russians in their Bosnian Serb style naivete pulled back troops from Kiev. And then Boris Johnson flies in, trains in, I believe. And it's like, if you sign a treaty with Putin, we're not going to, and you're going to lose all of our support. Now, Boris hasn't denied any of this. Ukrainskaya Pravda, or however they're called, actually had this extensive expose last May. And they basically said, he came in, this is what he told us. And he said, I speak for the entire West, do not make peace with Putin. Boris never denied this. He quibbled on some verbiage, but he never quibbled on any of the substance of this. He confirmed that that's what he said, and then he tried to sort of excuse himself by saying, but in my opinion, any peace with Putin would have been a bad peace. Well, that's not up to you to say, is it? Because he stopped being prime minister, 3 months later because of his COVID shenanigans, and now he's basically a highly paid lobbyist for World War III. So obviously, it's in his financial interest to advocate for war. But is it in the interest of Ukrainians who are dying by the tens of thousands? Obviously not.
Thank you for explaining that. It's definitely a very striking parallel where the conflict is being used, and sometimes partly frozen and then unleashed again, much like, Minsk was, for, in order to fulfill certain interests for these puppet masters. Since we're all about to depart, my last question is, do you think Ukraine will end up in sort of the Balkan situation, like the forgotten conflict that you keep mentioning throughout this conversation? Eventually,
if there is a compromise solution and Russia stops, then probably yes. But I'm not seeing any indication from Russia that it's intending to stop before this thing is resolved. The Balkans conflict, Milosevic honestly believed that by signing away the Serbs in the Serbs in Croatia and a third of the territory of the Serbs in Bosnia, he was buying peace with the West. He honestly believed that. And then, not even 3 years later, well, exactly 3 years later in November 1998, here comes NATO again because it's time for, Clinton's second term to be rescued from a sex scandal in the White House, and he needs to bomb somebody, and he decides he's going to support the Albanian separatists in Kosovo and launch that war and blame Milosevic for it again, which goes to show that you can't trust certain people or certain countries even.
Especially if there's a sex scandal going on. You definitely don't trust them and under those circumstances.
Right. And so, that was a mistake. And I believe everybody at this point understands it was a mistake. So when you've got, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande saying, oh, yeah, no, we backed Minsk in 2015 to buy Ukraine time to arm, and, we fooled these stupid Russians for 10 years. Okay, well, when people tell you who they are, believe them. What are you going to do? You just take them at face value. You judge them by their deeds and you judge them by their own confessions. So, I recently posted on Telegram that, there was this claim by Zbigniew Brzezinski that Russia cannot be an imperial power without Ukraine. He's a Polish nationalist, so obviously he had feelings about this, and he probably dreamed about restoring the Commonwealth. But what if, and I this is pure speculation, but this is where the facts on the ground are pointing me towards. What if the American leadership took him literally and didn't think of territory so much as the biomass? What if they decided that they can't stop Russia from actually taking the territory? So the next stage of the project to ensure that Russia doesn't become an empire, because at this point, I don't think they can really preserve their global hegemony, but they're thinking maybe we can just hurt Russia as much as we can in the process. What if they're trying to get as many Ukrainians killed as possible to ensure that the ones who survive will either be fanatical Bandera followers and therefore of no use to Russia and sort of a permanent threat, or dead?
Or in the West and never coming back.
Or in the West as, cheap manual labor for men, sex slaves for women, and Lord knows what for children. As, democratic Ukraine has been for 30 years before this whole Maidan mess in the first place.
I think you just outdid me in cynicism, but it's definitely something that has crossed, I think, a lot of people's minds, considering the level of depopulation that has been it's been taking place since before the war. There was, significant levels of immigration to other countries, but definitely the war escalated it. Yes, it's definitely something to consider. Hopefully your very
I really hope
dark
I'm wrong.
prediction. Yeah, I hope your dark prediction is this will be one of those predictions where you hope to be wrong about. Well, thank you so much for jumping on. I know you're very busy. We will link your new YouTube project, with which we obviously wish you a lot of luck. Marcelo, any final words?
Yeah, as usual, I just prefer to stay shut because listening to Nebojša is...
We just want Nebojša to lecture us.
Yeah, and it's fun and so much culture, so much knowledge that I just, prefer to stay shut as much as I can. Sometimes jokes just jump out. I cannot hold myself on that. But yeah, thank you very much, Nebojša. It's always a pleasure.
We might all have to pick up Holbrook's memoirs now that you've talked about them so poignantly. I think we might have to check them out. I haven't read that particular book.
Well, I never liked the man, but I think his memoirs are a great resource.
Yes, absolutely. That would be my take as well. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Nebojša, for coming on, and we will see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye-bye.